Hey guys, tonight we step together into a cold stone corridor, where dampness rises from the walls that once bore witness to the death of a king who had terrified all of Europe. No more throne, no more absolute power. Now there's only a rotting, swollen, leaking corpse, curled up amid the scent of incense and dried blood. In a chamber so tightly guarded you'd think his death alone could trigger rebellion. We won't be telling history the textbook way. Instead, we'll look directly into the final days of his life, the days when seizures forced attendants to hold his limbs tight to keep them from snapping, the days when blood and pus from ulcers that had eaten through to the bone began dripping onto the marble floor. This was not a glorious death. It was putrid, shameful, and haunting to the very fibers of flesh. Honestly, you might not make it through, at least not mentally intact, if you dare to stare into this death the way we're about to. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Where are you in the world right now? And what time is it where you are? Leave a comment and let me know so we can witness this night passing together, like some ancient rite. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Here is the full and accurate English translation of your text, with all numbers written out in words and preserving the original tone, grammar, and emotional contrast. Blood and power. These were the twin obsessions that defined the reign of Henry VIII. In the bleak winter days of the year 1547, as his body decayed from within, the most infamous king in English history faced death with the same ruthless resolve that had sent 2 of his wives and hundreds of enemies to the executioner's block. Within the cold inner chambers of Whitehall Palace, courtiers whispered, "The lion is dying," but his claws, though trembling, remained sharp until the very end. The road to that grotesque end was no sudden tragedy. It began decades earlier, when Henry was still a young prince, handsome, full of vigor, and famously dubbed the Golden Boy of the Renaissance, with his striking appearance, radiant eyes, commanding voice, and mastery of horseback riding, fencing, dancing, and music. He captured the admiration of all Europe. For a time, Henry was seen as the living embodiment of royal idealism, a child of the divine and of English destiny. And indeed, he left behind monumental achievements. He was the man who broke England free from the grip of the Roman Pope by founding the Church of England, an act both daring and dangerous. He built a formidable naval fleet, laying the foundations for what would become the British Maritime Empire. He restructured the administrative apparatus, reformed the legal system, and set the course for a centralized modern state. He loved the arts, sponsoring musicians, poets, and architects. And under his reign, Tudor royal culture flourished. Magnificent castles, solemn portraits, sacred church music, all bore the mark of Henry. But behind that gleaming surface was a man riddled with flaws few dared to speak of. Henry VIII was monstrously greedy. He craved ownership of everything: land, wealth, power, and women. His 6 marriages, 2 of which ended with wives being beheaded, weren't merely signs of romantic failure, but symptoms of a domineering and unstable spirit. He could not tolerate betrayal. Yet he was often the first to betray. He cast aside his first wife for not bearing him a son, then married a younger woman, only to accuse her of treason and have her executed. Henry was also pathologically jealous and ruthlessly suspicious. Anyone who appeared too close to the Queen or was rumoured to be disloyal could be interrogated, imprisoned, and executed without a fair trial. He didn't just kill enemies, he killed friends, relatives, even those most loyal to him, so long as he felt threatened. His mind gradually unraveled over the years, partly from illness, partly from an obsession with power and betrayal. Legend has it that he once sat for hours in silence, staring at a burning candle, only to erupt in rage and destroy everything around him, because the flame reminded him of the fires that consumed heretics. He even built a dungeon solely to imprison a man who had dreamed of being king in Henry's place. What kind of monarch does that? Was he even human anymore? His gluttony was yet another sign of inner decay. Lavish feasts, dozens of rich dishes, fine wines, roasted meats, pastries, cheese, sauces, pickles were served 3 times a day. His body ballooned like an overinflated sack, until even walking became a labor. It's said that at his heaviest, he weighed nearly 400 pounds and required a hoist just to mount a horse. From a proud young man, Henry became an obese tyrant, angry, paranoid, and so cruel that the entire court lived in fear. No one dared speak candidly. No one dared hold his gaze. Silence ruled the palace like an unwritten law. And yet, it is hard to deny that Henry VIII was a great figure. Great not only because of his vast accomplishments, but because he was profoundly human, a man of staggering contradictions, radiant like sunlight at noon, terrifying like a midnight storm. He loved art, yet burned books. He defended his country, yet massacred his people. He was both a reformer and a mass murderer. And it was these contradictions that made his death so bizarre, almost supernatural. In the month of January, in the year 1547, Henry VIII was little more than a pale shadow of the man he had once been. No longer did anyone behold the noble knight astride his steed, nor the impassioned ruler who once spoke with authority before his court. Instead, his subjects saw a swollen, suffering king whose body stank as though it had not yet been consigned to its grave. His once majestic frame, once the very emblem of strength and sovereignty, had become a battlefield of disease. His legs, which had thundered across marble floors, now lay festering, oozing pus and leaking blood without respite. Each step was torture, and even the mere odour from his wounds forced attendants to clamp their hands over their noses, stifle their retching, and avert their eyes. It was said that nearly all who entered the royal bedchamber emerged ashen-faced, tears in their eyes, not from sorrow, but from the assault on their senses. Henry's colossal bulk, estimated at nearly 400 pounds, rendered him immobile. His physicians were compelled to fashion a bespoke lifting apparatus, a sort of miniature crane system, to hoist him from his bed or lower him onto a wheeled sedan chair. That contraption, stationed within his chamber, groaned and creaked. Every time it moved, so humiliating a sound that the clank of metal seemed to mourn beside the rotting flesh. The face that once captivated noble women was now grotesquely swollen and distorted, sunken eyes, dull and listless, skin yellowed like wax, cracked lips that groaned with every shift of his head. Disease had not only ravaged his body, but stripped away every vestige of royal bearing. Each morning demanded nearly an hour of washing, ointment application, bandage changes, and herbal poultices solely to mask the miasma of death that permeated the room. Every remedy had been tried: lancet, bloodletting, boiled onion poultices, dustings of Egyptian herbal powder, ceaseless prayers, but all in vain. Even God, it seemed, had turned his face from the king, who had proclaimed himself the defender of the faith. Modern historians now believe he suffered from type 2 diabetes, chronic gout, and possibly osteomyelitis, a bone-eating infection that caused relentless agony. These clinical diagnoses only underscore his torment. Physical pain so severe he struggled for breath, and despair so profound he trusted no one, not even himself. Worse still was his shattered spirit. The legendary rage of Henry, once a tool of statecraft, had mutated into uncontrollable fury. On some days, he would bellow hoarsely at a courtier for accidentally spilling a goblet. On others, he lay silent for hours like a corpse, his vacant stare that of a forsaken child. Those dreadful silences proved more terrifying than any shout, for they revealed a mind fracturing into countless pieces. The stench of decay wafted not only throughout his chamber, but seeped through the cracks of its doors and rode the cold draughts along the stone corridors of Whitehall. Even the velvet drapes and plush carpets soaked in costly perfumes could not contain the rancid odour. Servants worked in endless shifts, face masked, gloved, spraying disinfectant over the polished flagstones, only to see the sickness-laden air return moments later. Buckets of cleansing solution, vinegar and eucalyptus oil were replaced without pause. Yet their sharp tang, mingling with the sickly sweetness of rot, struck newcomers like a physical blow. The derelict scene was further haunted by the incessant drone of flies, which would sometimes alight upon open sores. One trembling attendant later confessed that he nearly collapsed when he spotted a plump rat scurrying among the king's silken pillows in search of scraps. Life and death collided in that royal chamber, transforming it into a surreal nightmare. Even on the brink of oblivion, Henry agonized over the dynasty's future. He fretted incessantly over his 9-year-old son Edward, his final hope for Tudor immortality. Yet outside that fevered room, the Duke of Norfolk and Edward Seymour were already arraying their forces for the inevitable struggle over the throne, and though his hand shook so violently he could scarcely hold his quill, Henry stubbornly signed edicts and affixed the Great Seal to his last decrees, as though his dying hand could still command the world slipping away. Time was running out, and with each passing day, the reek of death grew ever more pungent in every stone. Every lintel reminding all that not even the mightiest king can escape the cycles of birth, aging, sickness, and death. The closer Henry VIII drew to death, the more his health was hidden like a matter of state secrecy. Royal gazettes issued formulaic proclamations, describing the king as robust, vigorous, and full of energy. On the walls of Whitehall Palace, where majestic portraits still hung, there was not a single word to hint at the truth. The once mighty monarch was now writhing in unbearable agony. Only a select few were permitted to enter the forbidden chamber, and each had to swear to keep forever secret any glimpse of his horrific decline. Stepping through the heavy door, visitors were immediately assailed by a strange, suffocating atmosphere. Inside, on a vast bed, draped in black velvet, lay the rotting corpse of a man who had once embodied the supreme power of England. Incense smoke strove in vain to mask the cloying stench of decay. The wisps of incense were like a fragile veil before a rising tide of miasma. Thick draperies swept the floor, yet could not prevent the fetid breath from assaulting nostrils, causing hearts to spasm. Henry's moans echoed through the stone corridors in a macabre symphony. Each wheeze, each painful gasp, cut through the silence like a funeral bell. When courtiers dared to peer through a curtain crack, they saw the king clutching his blanket, groaning in violent spasms. Even the slightest movement triggered convulsions so severe that his body contorted with each second of torment. The ulcers on Henry's legs' deep cavities gnawed to the bone, oozed blood and pus without pause. The physicians had tried every remedy, applying boiled onion poultices to draw out the infection, sprinkling powdered human skull in hopes of restoring the vital humours, rubbing on Egyptian herbal salves, even urging the king to pray ceaselessly. Each treatment only worsened the wounds, infections deepened, skin swelled red, and the stench grew more concentrated. When onion poultices turned black, blood and pus splattered over the sheets, forcing attendants to replace them constantly, their hands stained with the king's suffering countless times. Unable to stem his physical agony, the royal physicians resorted to high doses of opium. At first, the drug dulled the pain, his moans softened, his breathing sounded steadier, but the price was Henry's own mind, growing ever more clouded. He forgot where he was. Even the glorious years he had once lived. In his drugged stupor, His thoughts drifted into haunting memories, clashing swords. The screams of the condemned, the spectres of his victims returned before his eyes. In delirious moments, Henry muttered dreadful names. Anne Boleyn, then Catherine Howard. The hollow echoes of those names sometimes spurred him to bolt upright. Eyes rolled back as if trying to escape the oppressive shadows in his mind. Guilt, resentment, and regret seemed to swirl in every drop of opiate-laced blood, thrusting him into an internal battle more savage than any field engagement. It was said that only his sixth queen, Catherine Parr, dared to visit him in that fevered delirium. She would grasp his hand and whisper words of comfort, but his eyes reflected only ultimate terror. The collapse of a king once feared across Europe was laid bare in each ragged breath and cold bead of sweat sliding down his spine. It was only then that the court realized Henry's power had never resided solely in sword or scepter, but in the fractured pieces of a deeply flawed human being. While the entire court strove to preserve the image of health and prosperity, within the very heart of the palace the king's corpse betrayed him, putrefying, denouncing the futility of power before nature's truth. If official reports proclaimed that his reign was peaceful, the reality was a brutal struggle, man against his own mortality. No more trumpets, no formal declarations, only the sparse groans and the pervasive stench. A once mighty monarch now forced to submit to the unassailable cycle of birth, aging, illness, and death. Whitehall's bedchamber had become an invisible death trap, where every movement bore the imprint of agony. Even the ornate ceiling carvings meant to glorify his authority now seemed to mock the feeble body below. Each flickering candle only highlighted the isolation of one of history's most powerful figures. Reduced to a ghost in the very palace he once ruled. At the worst of his illness, the walls were hung with additional drapes to conceal the fluids seeping from his wounds, to protect the royal tapestries and robes. Yet the moment a curtain parted, that rancid odour billowed out as if to claim every corner. Attendants stood guard, ready to warn any who dared approach too near. In the midst of despair, Henry strove to wield the last vestiges of his authority. He still ordered a reduction of tariffs in the county of Dorset, still authorised funds for fortifications along the coast. As though his decaying body could not restrain his determined will, yet each shaky signature, each scrawled decree, betrayed a monarchy teetering, collapsing with every shallow breath. And at last, all realized that secret worth concealing at any cost was not the king's strength, but the powerlessness of a man against an inescapable fate. In the darkness of Whitehall Palace, Henry VIII confronted not only death, but himself, his ravaged flesh and fragmented soul laid bare before time's merciless decree. In the rare moments of lucidity, Henry VIII no longer concerned himself with royal edicts or courtly rites, but instead became consumed by a will that stretched for tens of pages of sheepskin. He read and reread it, revising every line, determined to seize control of the Tudor succession, even after his cold corpse lay in state. Every phrase was weighed with care, allocating estates, appointing offices, entrusting the regency to the most loyal, all to preserve his power beyond the grave. Though his body was failing, his obsession with authority remained undiminished. Each weary nod, each trembling stroke of his quill elicited shudders from all who beheld it. A king who would not relinquish his sovereign prerogative. Henry wavered constantly between two religious paths. In the morning, he would command a mass according to Catholic ritual, fill the royal chapel with resplendent incense and chant. By evening, he issued proclamations endorsing Protestant doctrine. Reading the Holy Scriptures in English, in his makeshift oratory, servants recalled that on some days he performed the Eucharist himself, only to insist that an English prayer book be placed by his bedside at night. Such indecision left both priests and preachers bewildered, unsure which command to follow first. Henry seemed no longer to choose his own spiritual course. but to let his soul drift helplessly between two shores. His faltering faith was further betrayed in his nightmares. Servants reported that many nights he would awaken from fevered dreams, soaked in sweat, muttering the names of the departed. Thomas More, Anne Boleyn, then Catherine Howard. His eyes would fly open, gaze, bleary yet searching, as though trying to catch the fleeting silhouettes of those he had condemned. Those spectral invocations rang out in the silent chamber, making all who heard them feel the world tilt, and their hearts pound as if some unseen tribunal were interrogating the king's very soul. Henry's decline precipitated a crisis of power within the Privy Council. Rumours of his condition spread, and factions moved in secret. The conservative Catholics, led by the Duke of Norfolk, seized the opportunity to consolidate influence. The Protestant faction under Edward Seymour likewise manoeuvred to obstruct their rivals. Lands, titles, and offices were bartered like chess pieces. Even while the king gasped for breath, whispered conversations and covert meetings darkened the palace with tension, shattering any illusion of a stable realm. Thomas Howard, the Duke of Norfolk, was the first to fall. At Henry's instruction, however faint his hand, Howard was condemned to death for treason. The execution warrant was written in crimson ink and sealed with the Great Seal, dispatched hastily across the kingdom. Yet Henry died too soon for the sentence to be carried out. Norfolk escaped the block, becoming a living testament to the tragic and swift disintegration of royal authority. On the 27th day of January in the year 1547, Henry endured a violent epileptic seizure. The bedchamber echoed with the shrieks of his guards as they wrestled him into place. Fearing he would break his own limbs, his body convulsed in relentless spasms. His ashen face, a ghastly spectre in the gloom. When the fit subsided, Henry lay motionless, half paralyzed and gibbering incoherently. His lips trembled, his gaze vacant. Recognizing no one, the horror of that moment drove dozens of courtiers to turn away, stifling choked sobs. The physicians, at their wits' end, resorted to extreme remedies. Red-hot irons were pressed to the king's flesh in a desperate bid to stimulate circulation. The glowing coals seared his skin, drawing fresh cries of agony. They forced him to swallow bitter draughts, concoctions of toxic herbs, charred honey, and thick, potent spirits in hopes of halting the seizures. Yet Henry lacked the strength to swallow. The passageways of his throat felt bone, dry. The acrid taste cut through him, deepening his choking anguish. At that point, every intervention served only to pour fuel on the fire of his suffering. In the brief stupor that followed, Henry's eyelids fluttered open, a flicker of utter terror reflecting in his gaze. It was as though, for a moment, he perceived that his end was imminent, his mind torn between agony and remorse. Witnesses even heard him whisper faintly, "I was wrong," before he sank back into a profound coma. No miracle arrived. Only his half-formed mutterings remained, a restless echo of the man who had once cast a long shadow across generations. Now, he watched helplessly as his own soul stood trial within the confines of his mind. Power, victory, glory all dissolved before the invisible forces of guilt and fear. The court, striving to uphold an image of strength, could no longer conceal the spiritual condemnation stamped upon their sovereign's heart. In the darkness of the royal suite, the priest's prayers intertwined with the king's raspy moans to form a tragic refrain. All bore witness to a ruler who had scaled the heights of triumph, now lost in a spiritual abyss. His soul judged in the very chamber where he had built the foundations of England's power. As the month of January gradually gave way to the month of February, Henry VIII fell into a haunting cycle of comas, waking briefly only to slip once more into unconsciousness. Each time he stirred, The vacant look in his eyes seemed to etch the decay of an entire kingdom. He lay upon a massive bed, propped up like a rotting statue, while the rising stench of death around him grew ever more pungent. Banners still flew in the courtyard, and liturgical music echoed beneath the vaulted corridors. Yet all seemed to pale before the grim reality confronting the once great sovereign. On the 27th day of January, in the year 1547, Henry drew ragged. Desperate breaths, each as heavy as a lifetime. At that moment, Archbishop Thomas Cranmer was summoned to his bedside. In the flickering candlelight, Cranmer's face was etched with solemn compassion. He placed a gentle hand upon the king's and, with a trembling voice, asked, "Do you believe in God?" It seemed even death itself paused to witness that grave question. Henry had no strength left to speak. Beads of sweat trickled down his gaunt brow. In lieu of words, he squeezed the Archbishop's hand, his final exertion. A silent testament that though his flesh had decayed, his spirit remained unbowed to the very end. Night waned, and dawn broke on the 28th day of January, in the year 1547. That morning's feeble sunlight slid through the stone window frame just as Henry drew his last breath. Every heartbeat ceased precisely as the sun emerged, marking the end of an indomitable tyrant. Henry's colossal corpse had hardly cooled before it began to rot. His flesh swelled grotesquely, and dark fluids seeped into puddles beneath the mattress. Exuding a sickly sweet stench, they draped his body in black velvet, vainly trying to conceal the odor of death. A pall darker than any shadow engulfed the royal chamber. Beneath that cloth, Henry's remains became a horrifying symbol of human powerlessness before nature's relentless laws. Word of his death was kept secret for 3 days. The Privy Council sternly instructed every member to keep the news sealed. Officially, this was to maintain order in the kingdom and to prevent unrest. Yet legend holds that behind Whitehall's brooding walls, the council chamber door never ceased swinging as conspirators plotted this or that scheme. The outward silence concealed a fiery conspiracy within. In less than 24 hours after his passing, Edward Seymour, uncle to young Prince Edward, quietly mobilized forces and seized the forts surrounding the capital. He deployed soldiers to guard the city gates, blocked every road to the palace, and no disloyal subject dared oppose him. Within hours, de facto regency power lay firmly in Seymour's grasp. While the public still reeled in shock, he already held the reins of authority, directing every vital matter of the realm. The people of London did not learn the truth until the 31st day of January, when church bells tolled throughout the city. Henry VIII was dead. The bells rang out in a sombre lament, as if bidding farewell to a king both magnificent and cruel. Past glories and present mourning mingled in that sound, causing countless hearts to tremble with awe and dread before the cycle of birth, aging, illness, and death. Yet the power struggle did not wait for funeral bells. It had begun long before, when Henry's might commanded universal reverence. Secret intrigues and deft negotiations among nobles and generals were already poised for the decisive coup. Henry's death merely provided cover for ambitious men to advance, completing a stealthy usurpation. During the 3 days of secrecy, Edward Seymour cemented his authority, appointing a loyal administrative corps, bestowing titles on capable commanders, securing the treasury's keys, and declaring to courtiers that he was the standard-bearer guiding the kingdom through the storm. By the time the news spread, it had been staged as a deft court performance. But the discerning knew that new power had already arisen. With Seymour at the centre, policy shifted quickly. Security tightened. Royal ceremonial lists were revised, and Prince Edward's education intensified to bolster the image of a youthful king. A new hope. All these measures were the perfect theatre to mask the bloody intrigue that had begun the moment Henry's breath faltered. When the public awoke to the official proclamation, they saw what seemed a stable realm, but in truth, the regime had changed hands. Henry's lifetime vow to preserve royal authority was swiftly rendered void by Seymour's edicts. Even the throne itself, the outward symbol of unshakable power, could falter in an instant, when its ruler's heart and vision were absent. Henry VIII's final moment stands as a heroic yet tragic emblem. A king closing his life in a desperate attempt to master both death and the future. The irony lies in the fact that the power he amassed over more than 2 decades proved meaningless before the hidden conspiracies. Thus, the Tudor dynasty underwent a seismic upheaval. Though the tyrant fell, the wheel of power continued to turn, never pausing. The corpse of Henry VIII decayed so swiftly that even the most renowned embalming experts recoiled in horror. They worked in a state of panic, each donning leather masks and thick gloves to shield themselves from the appalling stench of death. His entrails were unceremoniously removed and laid out upon a white draped table, the sound of dripping fluids echoing like rain on the roof of an abandoned chapel. His abdominal cavities were packed with potent aromatics, dried orange peels, cedarwood, camphor, and an assortment of rare herbal powders. Yet the sickly sweet reek still seeped through every fold of fabric, as if determined to dissolve all barriers. His liver lay, ruined, its tissue a dark, crumbling mass, fragmenting like the remnants of a decayed empire. His heart had swollen into a rigid, fibrous block, scarcely fitting into a standard coffin. His body was naught but a mass of rotting flesh soaked in pus. Its hue, a sickly olive yellow here dry, there oozing an apex of decomposition that even his former servants could not bear to witness. Those who once trembled before his power now turned away in abject terror at the sight of his inhuman remains. By royal custom, his coffin was to be crafted of thick lead, preventing the escape of odours and preserving his body from the outside elements. Yet Henry's extraordinary girth forced the coffin makers to construct a vessel twice the usual size. Its sturdy wooden frame was lined with crimson velvet, and the lead lid weighed so heavily that 8 pallbearers were required to lift it. Once the final coffin was assembled, it had to be lowered into the temporary vault beneath Whitehall Chapel by means of a small crane. During the lying in state, the coffin sagged ominously under the weight. All eyes followed the lead casket, now bulging so severely that a fissure ran along its side. From that crack, a thick, inky fluid leaked, pooling on the stone floor in repulsive rivulets. Guards hastily draped additional red carpets to conceal the spill, but the viscous liquid spread unabated. A royal hound, drawn by curiosity, lapped at the foul puddle, its tongue smeared black. That grotesque tableau became a bitter symbol. A king who once claimed to embody majesty, reduced to a heap of decay from which even animals sought sustenance. On the 16th day of February, the formal funeral procession commenced. Cavalry cloaked in black rode beneath horses draped in sable silks, their polished lances held aloft like grim sentinels. Thousands of citizens lined the streets as funeral drums and solemn trumpets sounded their lament. The rhythmic march of the riders resounded like a collective heartbeat stilled as the royal bier traversed the paved avenues. It left in its wake an invisible pall of humiliation and dread, seeping into the gaze of every onlooker. Although the court strove to maintain an air of solemn dignity, whispers about the horrifying spectacle spread among the crowd. Atop the cumbersome coffin rested a wax effigy depicting Henry in his prime, silk-lined doublet, peacock-feathered hat, gaze proud and commanding, one hand resting upon his gleaming sword. That idealized likeness stood in stark contrast to the putrefaction hidden beneath. The funeral unfolded like a twin drama, outward pomp and ceremony masking the grim reality of rotting flesh. All present understood that the polished figure was but a meaningless mask, concealing a horror beyond words. The final rites concluded at St. Yeatsote, George's Chapel in Windsor. Henry was interred beside Jane Seymour, the only one of his wives to bear him a son, and the sole consort not cast aside. She had died young, preserving in her heart an unselfish love. In death, Henry appeared to bestow upon her a singular honour, eternal rest alongside him in silent reverence. Their final shared cup of wine became a poignant farewell. Within the chapel's hushed chambers, only the faint flicker of candles and the creaking of the bier's lowering mechanism broke the stillness. The massive timber beams supporting the coffin groaned on the stone floor, each groan echoing like a unified voice bidding farewell. Intenser smoke, intended to mask the stench, rose in pale plumes among the chant of prayers. No miracle could redeem that colossal corpse, only the lingering shame of a monarchy that once fancied itself immortal. When the leaden coffin finally sank into the earth, a simple epitaph was inscribed upon the tomb. Henry VIII, King of England. No panegyric, no list of grand achievements, merely a name upon cold stone. Grass would sprout over the grave, flowers bloom and wither. Countless years would pass, and the memory of that gigantic corpse and its ultimate indignity would fade into history. Yet in the minds of those who witnessed it, the scene remained indelible. A man who wielded absolute power, brought low by the very laws of nature he had sought to command. Henry VIII, the greatest despot of the Tudor line, fell as a stark emblem of human finitude, reminding every generation that, however vast the power, the body must succumb to the inexorable decay of earth and time. Although his corpse had long since decayed, the image of Henry VIII was immediately lavishly embellished in courtly artworks, designed to erase the brutal reality beneath. The painter Hans Holbein, who had once captured Henry in the full vigour of health, was now commissioned to portray an immortal monarch. The finished portrait displayed broad, well-padded shoulders, a physique solid as a rock, feet planted firmly atop a painted crown and sword, one hand on his hip in confident defiance, his gaze challenging the world itself. That likeness displayed in the great hall of Hampton Court bore no relation to the truth. A corpse yellowed and bloated, riddled with festering wounds and exuding decay. Every brushstroke strove to convey strength and authority, in spite of all evidence that Henry had died in excruciating agony. The painting swiftly became an enduring icon in the English imagination, crafting a new legend of a valiant king who seemed never to bow to death. Not only through paintings, but also by printing his will, an extensive document of 30 pages on sheepskin meticulously, did Henry's image as a precise ruler endure beyond the grave. Every clause spelled out the order of succession. First Edward, his sole male heir, then Mary, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, and finally Elizabeth, daughter of Anne Boleyn. Despite the upheavals and conspiracies that threatened to thwart his intentions, that sequence was honoured almost intact in the years that followed. Many marvelled at Henry's clarity of mind in his final hours. He appeared to know that power truly endured only when codified in law, and so he devoted all his remaining strength to ensuring the Tudor bloodline's continued prosperity. Thus, even from his tomb, he maintained an invisible hand, guiding the realm through his 3 young children. However, safeguarding Edward's rightful inheritance did not proceed smoothly. Henry had established a regency council of 16 members, noblemen, and bishops of highest rank to govern the kingdom, until Edward came of age. The will listed each member in hopes of creating a collective mechanism, preventing excessive concentration of power in any one individual. But reality proved less cooperative. Edward Seymour, his ambitious and politically savvy uncle, moved swiftly once the council was constituted. He deftly allied himself with the Protestant faction, while leveraging the prestige Henry had bequeathed to attract loyalists. After only a handful of private meetings, Seymour had neutralized his most formidable rivals, causing them to lose standing or to withdraw quietly. Less than a week after Henry drew his last breath, Edward Seymour sat at the head of the Regency Council. Under the title Lord Protector, protector of young King Edward, he assumed control of every authority, the treasury, military command, and appointment of officials. The very renaming of the body from Regency Council to the Protector's Regency plainly signalled that Seymour now wielded the true power. Seymour's actions demonstrated one immutable truth. Even the most iron-willed sovereign cannot fully control the future once entombed. Henry had laboured painstakingly over his will, striving to safeguard the dynasty to his final breath. Yet he could not foresee that the conspiracies lurking in the shadows would erupt the moment his warmth faded. The tale of Edward Seymour's ascendancy in just 7 days astonished contemporaries. Later historians would call it the bloodless coup, for there was no bloodshed, no battlefield, only letters, seals, and the trembling nods of nobles. Yet the power of the pen proved as sharp as any sword. A single omitted clause might have delayed the transfer of authority. But Seymour's swift action rendered Henry's stipulations virtually moot. Meanwhile, Mary and Elizabeth, the next in the line of succession, were relegated to silent observers. They retained their titles, but lacked any real influence over state affairs. Many noted that while Henry's will was legally airtight, it left a critical enforcement gap. There was no mechanism to punish those who disregarded his wishes. The absence of such a safeguard meant that real power slipped from his grasp the moment he closed his eyes. Thus, the legend of Henry VIII extended through his portraits, his towering will, and the new title of Lord Protector. The image of a sovereign who seemingly refused to yield passed into history, even as his rotting corpse lay beneath stone. People spoke of Henry in both solemn and awed tones: the husband who beheaded queens, the founder of the Church of England, the architect of a naval armada. He became a legend, a figure both magnificent and terrifying, fashioned from his own decayed remains. Yet beneath that radiant facade lay a sobering lesson in the limits of human power. Henry controlled every detail to his dying breath, yet could not command the hands that brought his will to light or left it untouched. Power, however fast, depends on the loyalty and ambition of the living. And so, upon the decaying flesh of a king, his successors swiftly erected the Tudor legend in brilliant reds of the written word, the gold of seals and the black ashes of death. The final days of Henry VIII became the subject of medical study for centuries thereafter. Physicians offered a bewildering array of diagnoses. Some believed he suffered from syphilis contracted during his youthful visits to France. Others insisted his primary malady was severe gout, brought on by a diet rich in fats and potent wines. Yet others argued he had type 2 diabetes, with complications that caused his body to swell alarmingly. Meanwhile, modern specialists noted that the ulcer on his leg closely matched the symptoms of chronic osteomyelitis, and theories of the rare MacLeod syndrome or traumatic brain injury from early jousting contests could not be dismissed. Despite every diagnosis, 16th century treatments resembled savage rituals. At one point, attendants placed a live pigeon, split in two, directly upon his ulcerated flesh, hoping the bird would draw poison from the wound. Many physicians ground precious gemstones into powder, mixed it with rosewater, and spread it over his skin, believing it would restore the vigor of his humours. On occasion they applied a paste of molten gold dust infused with horse bile and ratany root, expensive concoctions, yet utterly ineffective. Traditional methods, such as cupping and deliberate lancing to let out the blood, were also deployed without restraint. The king's trembling hand was marked by long, jagged cuts as blood and tissue spilled onto his sleeve, all in the dim gloom of the royal infirmary. On one occasion, a reckless doctor burned dried mugwort and funneled its smoke into Henry's nostrils in an attempt to clear his channels, only to provoke violent fits of coughing and worsen his breathing. Meanwhile, embalming equipment cluttered the bedchamber. The embalmers brought jars of salt, aromatic resins, zinc, lead, and mercury substances believed to preserve the body. They removed his entrails, stuffing the cavities with dried orange peel, star anise, cedar shavings, camphor, and nutmeg, then burned incense, sticks around the bed to mask the stench of death. Yet the odour of decay still permeated the room, seeping through velvet drapes and wooden shutters, proving all efforts in vain. Amid the cursed vials lay a few humanizing mementos. A small silver-framed portrait of Jane Seymour, his third wife, who bore him a prince, rested on the bedside table. Beside it was a lock of hair said to belong to his mother, Elizabeth of York, carefully bound in an engraved wooden box. There was also a handwritten prayer book belonging to his young daughter Elizabeth, its pages browned with age and its ink blurred by damp. Those keepsakes at least suggested the ruthless king retained a measure of human feeling. A father's love for his child, a daughter's bond with her mother, a husband's devotion to his wife. Even as everything else crumbled away, in his fevered delirium, Henry sometimes convulsed toward Jane's portrait, as if seeking one last shred of comfort. He would whisper her name in ragged gasps, Jane, my child, even as the cold wind rattled the window. But family affection could not halt the maelstrom of power. Outside the sick chamber, courtiers remained locked in ruthless contention for the throne. The Archbishop, the Privy Council, and Edward Seymour engaged in merciless jockeying. Medicine bowls clattered to the stone floor, and the prayer book tumbled among them, abandoned as the struggle for sovereignty erupted. When the final physician withdrew the shroud, Henry lay motionless beneath the black velvet cover, his eternal sleep concealing the last groans of agony. The family keepsakes were gathered into a small chest, destined for secret safekeeping. All understood that in a life defined by brutality, those fragments of memory were the only testament to a man's vulnerability. Then the court, clad in layers of sable, moved to the burial rites, the funeral procession, the coffin. The solemn pageantry all proceeded with solemn haste. Beneath the black pall draping his bier lay the horrifying legacy of Tudor medicine. No remedy had healed his festering wounds. No measure had dispelled the stench, and no keepsake could erase the humiliation of his ultimate suffering. More than 4 centuries later, medical historians still debate Henry's final diagnosis. Some pore over archival records, analyzing traces of the poultices once used. Others even examine the portrait he last beheld on the night of his passing. Each new discovery spawns fresh theories, demonstrating that his death remains a profound mystery, even though his corpse has long since returned to dust. Perhaps the greatest tragedy was not the bizarre treatments themselves, but the fate of a great man who once dominated Europe, ultimately forced to endure the gruesome ravages of his own flesh. Henry VIII, once a living tempest, now endures as a legend steeped in blood and the odor of death, a timeless admonition of the limits of medicine and of humanity itself. The death of Henry VIII was not merely the closing chapter of one man's life, but the shattering of a power structure that had endured for decades. The moment word of the king's passing spread, the traditional Catholic faction, those still loyal to the Roman pontiff, found themselves pushed to the margins of political life. They had hoped to tighten their grip on influence as Henry weakened, but Edward Seymour, the new young king's ambitious uncle, swiftly exploited the vacuum to advance a program of Protestant reform. Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, who had held Henry's hand in those final moments to impart comfort, emerged as the central figure in the ecclesiastical revolution. No sooner had Seymour secured control than Cranmer drafted and promulgated a series of reforming injunctions: the abolition of the Latin Mass, permission for priests to marry, and a mandate for all services to be conducted from the English Bible. Within mere months, many ancient Catholic churches were renamed Churches of the Lord, and worship was conducted according to Protestant rites. In under 2 years, the Book of Common Prayer appeared a landmark innovation that Henry himself had never dared undertake. This volume compiled the liturgies, prayers, and baptismal rites entirely in the mother tongue of the English people. Cranmer personally oversaw every word, determined to forge a uniform ritual for the entire realm. Its first printing in 1559 sent shockwaves through England. The Protestant faction rejoiced, while the Catholics railed against it as treasonous and the destruction of sacred tradition. Henry's own religious legacy had been fraught with contradiction. He had severed ties with Rome and declared himself supreme head of the Church of England. Yet he retained numerous Catholic ceremonies and vestments. This very inconsistency allowed both Catholic traditionalists and Protestant reformers to claim him as an ideological ancestor. Each side cited his edicts, his criticisms of radical doctrine, or his preservation of certain rights to bolster its argument that Henry had, in truth, followed their respective paths. Under the reign of Edward VI, royal religious policy swung like a pendulum. In the first 2 years, with Seymour and Cranmer at the helm, the tide of Protestantism surged. Shrines were dismantled, holy images destroyed, and clergy compelled to preach in English. But then Mary Tudor ascended the throne in a stunning reversal. As the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, Mary remained steadfast in her loyalty to Rome. She rapidly restored Catholic ritual, expelled Protestant bishops, and condemned hundreds of reformers to the block in what became known as Bloody Mary. Howlove. Within a few more years, it was Elizabeth I, daughter of Anne Boleyn, who claimed the crown, and religious policy was once again recalibrated. Elizabeth and her advisers established the so-called Elizabethan religious settlement, retaining the name Church of England and rejecting the Pope's authority. Yet preserving many Catholic ceremonies and clerical attire, the English scriptures continued to circulate, but the style of worship adopted a moderate, middle-road approach designed to satisfy both camps. Immediately following Henry's death, the court moved urgently to craft a majestic image for the boy Edward VI in order to maintain the illusion of dynastic continuity. They proclaimed Edward the Anointed of the Lord, embellishing tales of divine appointment. Portraits of Edward were explicitly modelled on his father's stance, legs wide, cose resolute, one hand resting atop the hilt of the so-called Millennium Sword. In the throne room at Greenwich, the empty throne was arrayed with crimson silk drapes, a gilded canopy, and dragon-carved stonework measures meant to compel courtiers and commoners alike to bow before an unseen authority still bearing Henry's imprint. Court ceremonial persisted on a 24-hour cycle: processions, proclamations, blessings, formal declarations, and sacrificial rites. Throughout Edward's enthronement, fireworks blossomed overhead, cannons thundered, and drums echoed through the city. Yet a casual observer could see that the throne stood silent, devoid of a living sovereign. The facade of unbroken monarchy concealed the deep fissures within the court. All these rituals and symbols were staged to uphold a single illusion, that though the king had died, the monarchy itself remained immutable. Behind the palace's darkened walls, factions met in secret, negotiating land grants, assigning offices, and preparing for this interim transfer of power. Army commanders, civil administrators, and council members were all reorganized to serve the new regime, though whether it would endure remained uncertain. In an effort to project stability, senior officials even encouraged scholarly debates between Catholic theologians and Protestant ministers. They sanctioned public services where a priest and a reformer might share the pulpit to expound their views. The aim was to transform religious discourse into a civilized forum and avoid armed conflict. Yet these gatherings often degenerated into fierce disputations, leaving participants unsettled. Perhaps the greatest challenge lay in distributing the Book of Common Prayer to the countryside. Many remote villages lacked Protestant clergy and had to rely on pirated copies or readings by local bailiffs. This inconsistency undermined the populace's trust in the crown, as people witnessed policies shifting unpredictably and could not discern which religious path was genuine. The situation grew more fraught when Edward VI, barely 10 years old, fell gravely ill. Rumours of his fragile health spread like wildfire, prompting factions to swarm the palace gates with tokens of loyalty, bribes for office, and even whispered plots of assassination. As power teetered, the authority was called into question, despite the outward pageantry continuing apace. In sum, the death of Henry VIII marked the beginning of a profound, if unseen, religious and political transformation, the Tudor court evolved in darkness, from a sacred regime centered on the person of the monarch to a new order of rituals and statutes, where power was divided and regulated by law and council. Monarchy was no longer absolute, but depended upon a network of nobles, clergy, and soldiers, an essential turning point, heralding the dawn of modern England. The death of Henry VIII sent shockwaves throughout all of England. For nearly 40 years, he had ruled the mist-shrouded realm, with an iron hand levying taxes mercilessly, imposing religious laws, and ordering the execution of his opponents. Now that he was gone, the entire kingdom seemed to slip into a spiritual crisis. Common folk, from the smallest village to the grandest city, I felt an invisible wave of terror spreading, as though the once invulnerable establishment had finally shown its hidden cracks. Contemporary records for the year 1547 recount a host of ominous portents. People dreamed of blazing meteors streaking across the night sky, sometimes trailing green and red tails like harbingers of destruction. Some dreams warned of unending storms. Others featured visions of standing on a battlefield, back turned toward the cold stone of Whitehall Palace, only to hear the winds shriek as if it were a moan. Many so-called seers claimed to have witnessed strange celestial phenomena, a blood-tinted crescent moon, comets appearing twice in swift succession, convincing the populace that appalling misfortune was at hand. Not only the common people, but also nobles and scholars were thrown into turmoil. They recorded sightings of pale shapes drifting through chamber corners, vague silhouettes resembling Henry in his velvet robes, eyes dull, yet fixed upon those who remained. Moans echoed along empty corridors at night. Even though the palace lamps were extinguished, and guards dared not draw the curtains, almost everyone questioned about these midnight visions, shuddered as they recalled the ghostly image of a once majestic king, now silently seated within a half-open doorway. It was not only England that reacted. Across the Channel, Francis II, King of France and once Henry's comrade in arms, offered genuine mourning. He donned black for 3 days, dispatched ambassadors to relay condolences, and prayed earnestly for his late friend's soul. By contrast, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles, the fifth grandson of Catherine of Aragon, was far more circumspect. He assessed the geopolitical landscape. An England ruled by a 10-year-old child, with Edward Seymour and the Protestant faction scheming in the wings, could become an easy target for opportunistic attacks. Charles demanded detailed reports from England's Catholic lords, warning them to guard against the kingdom's possible collapse. Even Pope Paul III, who had once excommunicated Henry upon his break with Rome, showed a measure of compassion. He dispatched a delegation to hold a grand requiem at St. 25, Peter's Basilica, praying for the soul of the monarch who had defied the papal see. This gesture both demonstrated the Church's mercy and subtly reminded the world of the power to judge souls that the papacy had historically wielded. Meanwhile, Henry's bedchamber at Whitehall became a place feared and shunned. Courtiers whispered that they dared not approach the room after dusk. On one occasion, a guard claimed to have heard moans through a crack in the door. Despite the interior being pitch black, an unexplained cold draft would sweep the slightly ajar shutters, causing candles to gutter as though about to die. This phenomenon continued until even the most seasoned attendants refused single-person watch, pairing up in shifts so that none would remain alone. Remarkably, young King Edward VI himself refused to sleep in that very chamber, which had been witness to so many intrigues and acts of cruelty. The boy sovereign declared that the room was no place for the living, and warned any who lifted Henry's coffin lid that they would suffer ill fate. In the palace corridors, tales of the haunted chamber spread, and many muttered that it was there Henry's absolute power, in both life and death, lingered as a dark spectre. The authority Henry had once wielded alive or dead had been reduced to a single haunted room. All efforts at concealment, embalming, and ceiling proved powerless against the whispers of the departed. The people said that if anyone dared open that chamber at midnight, they would hear heavy footsteps and the creaking of axe and mallet like the knell of a tarnished bell tolling for a bygone dynasty. Each nightfall saw shadows avoiding the Whitehall precincts, quietly recalling that Henry's spirit did not rest, but still roamed the corridors, seeking someone to whom he might pass on his curse. Some Lancashire mediums even swore they had seen his figure drifting through village lanes, black cloak billowing, eyes aflame, instilling dread in anyone who beheld him. These dire omens compelled the court to take them seriously. They performed prayers to exorcise the spectre, burned additional incense, and held purification rites at Whitehall. Yet no ceremony could hold the restless spirit at bay. Henry had been too formidable in death, ready to sow terror in the living hearts of his subjects. Thus, by the flickering light of the abandoned bedchamber, Henry VIII remained present, his flesh long faded, but his ghostly power still hovering, reminding all that no one truly escapes his horrifying legacy. In the darkness, every ragged breath and every shiver echoed like a funeral bell, affirming that only one certainty endures: the dread inspired by absolute power, even when its wielder lies silent beneath the cold earth. The death of Henry VIII became one of the most meticulously documented royal medical cases in history. From annotations in court ledgers to the private journals of each royal physician, every treatment administered during his final months was recorded in exacting detail, from bloodletting cups to poultices of herbal remedies, from rudimentary hydrotherapy, baths infused with medicinal herbs, to massages using rare scented oils. Each bandage change and each dose of medicine was entered into the logs with the date, dosage, and the king's physical response. Despite receiving the most advanced treatments available at the time, every method failed, starkly revealing medicine's inability to arrest inner decay. Bloodletting cups only removed a little poisonous humours, but could not cleanse the festering wounds. Herbal poultices provided momentary relief, only for the ulcers to swell and suppurate again. Hydrotherapy, thought to stimulate circulation, left him more exhausted and triggered recurring fevers. The physicians from Thomas Wendy to Gilbert Dethick pored over these records time and again, comparing outcomes, and reached the same conclusion. Medicine was powerless. That very failure stands as a blunt testament to a universal truth. No matter how great one's fame, authority, or wealth, the human body ultimately succumbs to forces beyond its control. Henry, the monarch who once believed he could bend fate itself to his will, was reduced to relying on desperate, futile remedies. Before his final rest, Henry also left a detailed will describing the grandest tomb ever envisioned in English royal history. He wished for a sepulchre of pristine white marble, adorned with 40 bronze effigies of Tudor heirs, crowned by a colossal equestrian statue atop the highest pinnacle. This magnificent undertaking promised to become an eternal monument, securing his place in posterity. Yet that tomb was never completed. When the English Civil War erupted more than a century later, those precious bronze statues were melted down to supply munitions for the armies. The tragedy lies in the fact that Henry, who all his life had obsessed over his own image, never obtained a fitting monument. His will's drawings and the splendid sketches now survive only in archives, testifying to an unrealized ambition. In the aftermath of his death, many who had fallen from favor under Henry sought to return to court. They hoped his dynastic legacy would shield them, despite having previously suffered imprisonment or exile. Meanwhile, those who had enjoyed his favor clung fiercely to the remnants of power. Currying influence with Edward Seymour and the Protestant nobles, many simply could not adapt to the rapid changes. Some lost all their status and fell into ruinous vices, while others, overwhelmed by despair, chose to end their own lives. Several long-time servants of Henry, the very men who once rushed to deliver his medicines and record his pulse and blood pressure, found themselves obsolete in Edward VI's reign. where caution replaced impulsiveness. With Henry's departure, the absolute monarchy he had fiercely constructed began to tremble at its foundations. Power no longer resided solely in one man, but passed into the hands of councils and the aristocracy. The unwritten rules of Henry's reign, absolute commands not to be questioned. Taxes that could not be refused gave way to negotiations and jockeying for influence. Thus, Henry's medical legacy carries a dual character. On one hand, it provided future generations with invaluable empirical data, detailed case histories, treatment outcomes, and systematic records that laid groundwork for modern medicine. On the other, it serves as a reminder of the fragile limits of knowledge and technology in the face of death, and of the lesson that even absolute power cannot overcome the ravages of time and mortality. The transition of power unfolded amid intrigue and regret. Edward VI, Mary, and Elizabeth Henry's 3 children each inherited their father's medical legacy like a twin curse and blessing. His greatness enshrined, and his inevitable decay etched together, court life henceforth became a battleground of laws, ideas, and doctrines, rather than the domain of a single will. Overall, Henry VIII's medical legacy advanced the understanding of disease, promoted systematic record-keeping, and encouraged pharmacological research. Yet it was precisely the worship of absolute rule and the blind faith in miraculous cures that laid bare the ultimate limit. No throne, no palace, no wealth could heal a body ravaged by time. The fusion of autocratic governance with the desperate hope for any panacea proved futile, leaving a profound lesson for later generations about the ties between power and our shared humanity. The death of Henry VIII marked a profound turning point in English governance. Under the reign of Edward VI, power no longer resided solely in the person of the monarch, but gradually shifted to the council of nobles and leading statesmen. Edward Seymour, who held the regency, lacked the commanding presence and magnetic authority of Henry, and was therefore compelled to negotiate with his senior ministers. He weighed every decision, bargained over every decree, to preserve the fragile influence he had inherited. Although the Protestant reforms were briefly reversed under Mary I, the foundations of a monarchy subject to collective oversight had already been laid, foreshadowing a more constitutional regime. The royal physicians who had once tended Henry VIII did not escape the upheaval. Those entrusted with saving the formidable king suddenly found themselves ostracized or seeking service with other noble patrons. Some were investigated for alleged negligence, and a few were even arrested on suspicion of having hastened the king's demise. Whether inadvertently or intentionally, the debates among the court's medical council grew ever more intense, raising questions about the responsibility, ethics, and competence of the Tudor medical establishment. Among them, Dr. Thomas Wendy, who had the courage to inform Henry of his dire condition when other physicians hesitated, was retained by Edward to serve the young sovereign. Wendy's honesty, though unsettling to the king's entourage, was recognized as an act of loyalty and integrity. In contrast, the apothecaries who had prepared Henry's bespoke remedies faced unprecedented scrutiny. They were required to document the provenance of each herb, submit their formulations for review, and maintain sample archives, lest any evidence surface that they had contributed to the king's decline. More than a century later, during the refitting of St. George's Chapel at Windsor, modern historians and physicians exhumed Henry's remains. The analysis of his enormous skeleton confirmed severe damage to his leg bones from chronic ulceration, consistent with historical accounts of osteomyelitis. His living weight was estimated at 400 pounds, nearly 200 kilograms, providing the clearest evidence of his obesity and edema. Surviving vials from the tomb, when chemically tested, revealed residues of lead and mercury, 2 toxic substances once used for disinfection and embalming. Henry's body, though long decayed, still bears witness to one undeniable fact: no throne, no crown, no treasury can arrest the cycle of birth, aging, illness, and death, looking upon his fractured ribs and bowed spine, one might hear the echo of that final breath from a ruthless monarch, delivering the message that death makes no distinction between wealth and authority. Medical and historical scholarship continue to remind us that Henry, who once imposed his will upon a nation, ultimately bowed before the smallest microbes and the inexorable power of disease and time. Thus, the Tudor medical legacy is twofold. On one hand, it provided meticulous case reports, experimental treatments, and pioneering clinical observations that helped shape subsequent British medical practice. On the other, it served as a stark caution to physicians and to society that, regardless of might, human beings remain finite. In the libraries of Cambridge and London, copies of the Henry case files are treasured not only as artifacts but also as warnings of the limits of knowledge and technology. The transfer of power unfolded amid regret and ambition. Edward VI, Mary I, and Elizabeth I, Henry's three children, each inherited their father's complex medical and political legacy. Each interpreted his will and medical lessons in his or her own way. Edward advanced Protestantism. Mary repudiated Henry's intentions, and Elizabeth sought a middle path. The royal court thus became a forum for laws, doctrines, and scholarship, rather than merely the arena for a single sovereign's will. Overall, Henry VIII's medical legacy broadened understanding of disease, encouraged systematic record-keeping, and spurred pharmaceutical research, laying the groundwork for modern medicine. Yet it was precisely the blind faith in absolute power and miraculous cures that exposed the ultimate limit when the body fails. Political power, too, fades into obscurity. His death became a dialectic on the relationship between humanity and mortality, between authority and compassion, and between the yearning for immortality and the fragile reality of life. In the grand tapestry of history, Henry VIII stands as a vivid example that an absolute monarchy can indeed wield tremendous power, but must eventually give way to a more accountable political model. The intertwining of his medical legacy with the posthumous power struggles initiated a new era, one in which authority is dispersed, in which disease is no longer a courtly secret, and in which even kings must confront the impermanence of existence. In his final days, Henry VIII seemed to believe that a sufficiently imperious command could compel his body to obey and grant him more time. He barked at his physicians as if ordering an army. "Save me! Cure that ulcer immediately!" Whenever a doctor dared to hesitate or refuse, the king flew into a rage, as though his very life were a matter of state to be resolved by fiat. But flesh knows no fear of royal command. It decayed day by day, pus seeping through the dressings, skin blistering and cracking. The agony drove him to cry out like a defeated soldier, utterly unconcerned with orders. No sacred remedy held the power to halt that destruction. How ironic that the palace, once shaken by Henry's edicts, now echoed only with faint moans. No one saw a majestic monarch any longer, only a corpse too dreadful to touch. Attendants who had once rushed forward to carry his litter now shrank back in terror. They pushed his bed with long poles, avoiding any direct contact with rotting flesh. The look on a servant's face, seeing him suspended between death and torment, revealed a truth. No matter how absolute one's power, the human body remains helpless before biological tragedy, even at the point of death. Protestant chroniclers hasten to record the moment when Henry gripped Archbishop Thomas Cranmer's hand, touting it as irrefutable proof of the king's final conversion. They described an outpouring of piety, Henry, awakening to a new faith, clasping the hand of the English cleric, as though relieved to be liberated from the sword of Rome. Woodcuts and later illustrations immortalized that solemn posture, presenting him as joyfully saved from the papal blade. By contrast, exiled Catholic clergy outside England insisted that Henry departed this world in torment. Regretting his schism from Rome, They claimed he shrieked the name of the Virgin Mary amid his convulsions. His soul shackled between two abysses, remorse for his break with the Church and nostalgia for the Latin rites that had once nourished his spirit. These accounts spread swiftly through Vatican dispatches, intended to warn European courts of the peril posed by Protestant defiance. Yet the reality was more complex. Henry VIII was never a true adherent of Luther or any single reform movement. Throughout his reign, he styled himself Supreme Head of the Church of England, preserving manifold Catholic ceremonies from incense, laden masses to anointing rituals. He embraced neither new doctrine completely, nor did he return to the papal fold. He shaped religion to suit his own purposes, as he had moulded every aspect of statecraft, marriage, diplomacy, law. To him, faith was a tool of power and image, to be calibrated in service of the crown. Even his death became a battleground of propaganda. Protestant writers extolled his supposed penitence as proof of the gospel's triumph. Catholic polemicists depicted a monarch racked by remorse, destined to atone in the fires of damnation. Each side seized upon that final moment to bolster its narrative. Some declared Henry had awakened to conscience. Others insisted he descended into hell, everlasting, yet few paused to ask, in that last throe, did he truly comprehend faith? Or was he merely convulsing in delirium, gripped by terror to the marrow? The fact is that, facing the absolute boundary of life and death, he was simply a frightened man. No crown remained upon his brow, no throne beneath him, only a ravaged body and a mind awash in anguish. The choking moans no longer carried the force of royal commands, but served as the final utterance of a soul in ruin. Henry, who had ruthlessly dispatched 2 queens, executed kinsmen, and crushed resistance, now confronted the universal human terror, betrayal by his own flesh. Perhaps, in the sweep of history, the woodcuts and engravings commemorating his conversion or remorse were humankind's way of evading a simple truth. Death chooses no faction. It devours monarchy and church alike. Absolves, nocin, defies all power. The consternation of both court and clergy stands as testament to this invisible might. And so Part 13 closes on the image of Henry once, a proud tyrant reduced at last to a solitary corpse amid incense and the stench of decay. His mighty voice incapable even of stifling those faint lamentations. In that final instant he was neither the fearsome king nor a mythic figure, but simply a mortal stripped of hope, a stark reminder. However vast one's power, it cannot bend the harsh realities of life and death to its will. Immediately after Henry VIII passed away, the Regency government under Edward Seymour was confronted with a terrifying crisis. The national treasury lay almost completely depleted. 3 decades of unceasing warfare had drained the coffers, and King Henry's extravagant habits, spending nearly £200 million sterling by today's standards on palace construction alone, had further impoverished the realm, straining any administration to its limits. To avert financial collapse, Edward Seymour resolved to continue the policy of confiscating and selling church lands initiated by Henry. This decision quickly became the largest transfer of property in English history. Fertile fields, grand manors, and ancient castles formerly held by the church fell into the hands of newly elevated nobles and wealthy merchants. The influx of cash temporarily replenished the treasury, but it also sowed deep resentment across every countryside and borough. The relentless pace of auctions drove land prices through the roof. Inflation spread like wildfire through every commodity: grain, cloth, salt, and even housing. Peasants struggled to pay taxes. Townsfolk protested when the price of bread doubled, and minor aristocrats had to hire guards to defend their newly acquired estates from desperate rioters. Numerous rural uprisings broke out. Tax collectors were beaten, treasury chests were looted, and swords rang out in the dead of night. Henry's corpse, once the supreme symbol of authority, became a living metaphor for England itself, bloated with power, yet rotten at its core. On the pulpits of radical preachers, the king's ulcerous legs were dissected as emblematic of national moral decay. They argued that, just as a surgeon must lance a festering wound, society required a purging operation to excise corruption and injustice. That rhetoric spread swiftly, sparking a silent overthrow not by cannon or blade, but through a series of new statutes and decrees. The Regency Council enacted laws to tighten control over the land market, mandated that all taxes receive collective approval, and even authorized emergency levies to compensate for war expenses. No one spoke of absolute personal authority as under Henry. Instead, they proclaimed that power resides in Parliament, and those whom the people authorize. In this period, England quietly distanced itself from the medieval notion of divine monarchy and took its first steps into a more modern polity. Authority ceased to be an unquestioned command and required the consent of multiple parties and institutions. Though awkward and at times bloody, this transition laid the groundwork for a controlled despotism, in which the monarch could no longer act unilaterally but depended on the counsel of the Privy Council and Parliament. Yet the road was paved with suffering. The poor cried out for relief. Old noble families wept over lost lands, and the church lamented the loss of its endowments. Many people faced a grim choice between enduring harsh taxes or joining rebellious movements. Social unrest persisted throughout the reigns of Edward VI, Mary I, and Elizabeth I, each monarch inheriting the financial and social crises bequeathed by Henry. In the end, this silent transfer of power left a profound lesson. A nation cannot survive on personal authority and amassed wealth alone. As Henry's rotting body symbolized the decay of absolute rule, so too did the empty coffers reveal the cracks in England's financial foundations. Through a crisis of finance and a bloodless overthrow, England learned that true strength springs from the distribution of power and collective responsibility, not from crowns or ornate palaces. The death of Henry VIII marked a crossroads between two eras in English history. On one hand, the court honoured traditional royal funeral rites, a magnificent funeral procession lasting several days, with thousands of citizens and soldiers standing in solemn ranks along the route, a lifelike wax effigy of the late king placed reverently atop his coffin, and cavalry clad in black draped in mourning cloth. Their measured hoofbeats echoing throughout the palace, the beat of the funeral drums and the mournful blasts of the horns resonated from every tower, evoking memories of past glory. Yet, to a closer look within the royal household and the medical chambers revealed the imprint of a new age. Detailed medical records documented every medicine and treatment method employed during the king's final days, something unprecedented in any prior royal death. His lengthy, meticulously drafted will, with stipulations for the distribution of his estates, the establishment of a regency council, and legal constraints, signalled a nation preparing to enter an age of rule of law, rather than relying solely on the personal authority of a monarch. Administratively, the regency machinery sprang into complex action. New edicts were drafted, official papers required collective signatures, and the tax system was reorganized under a collective mechanism. This was an early manifestation of modern bureaucracy, in which the cabinet and council shared responsibility rather than relying on a single voice from the throne. It was precisely this contrast that made Henry's death so haunting, not only the images of his decaying corpse, but also the harsh truth of the message. A powerful king is nonetheless a fragile human being. In his final moments, he was no longer the Pope's decapitator, no longer the man with 6 wives, but simply a dying soul, trembling as he grasped another's hand, begging for forgiveness for earthly sins, stripped of political splendor. All that remained was his naked helplessness. Archbishop Thomas Cranmer's last whispered words to him were, "You are about to enter a realm where no title has value and no power offers protection." In that instant, Henry VIII, the most notorious king in England, touched the one universal point shared by all his subjects, the fear of death and the ultimate futility of human power. There was no crown, no royal insignia, only a cold body, exhaling its final breath. The funeral narrative spoke of grand ceremonies, but could not mask the cruel truth. No matter how exalted the throne, its veneer erodes with time and is ultimately destroyed along with the flesh it once commanded.